Let's begin exiting the A.S.A.P lane with Alan.
Hello, everyone. This is Alan Steelman, and I can make one promise to you today, and that promise is you're going to be very inspired by today's guest and a life story that, like all of our lives, illustrates the central lesson from the Wizard of Oz, that we have within us all that we need to lead a life of balance and equilibrium. That was the moral of the story. What none of us realized when we read the story as children or watched the movie was that we were also watching our own life story playing out before our very eyes. Each of us has to deal with brain fog, heartbreak, and the need for courage at critical times in our lives. The Scarecrow and his need for a brain to make wise choices, the Tin Man who needed a new heart to be in love again, and the King of the Jungle, the Cowardly Lion, who was embarrassed that he was a coward. And along with Dorothy and Toto, they were all on their way to see a wizard who was going to fix all of this for them. As you remember, he turned out to be a wrinkled up little old man who couldn't do anything for them, a false wizard. You know, life today in the digital age is marked by record levels of stress and anxiety, and the temptation to seek out false wizards becomes too much for many. Will Parkinson, who is my guest today, is a very successful businessman, yet I think he will tell us that his life story is much like that of the wizard, including spending much of his adult life seeking and using false wizards to deal with the physical handicap, along with the stress and anxiety that go with building a successful business and raising a family. As you hear about his life, you will see that he suffered a life-altering event as a 16-year-old when he lost a leg in an accidental shooting incident. Adding to the trauma of the incident was that he was a three-sport athlete in school and had to give up all three. He and his wife Ashley have 5 children, and Will has commented on the strain that his physical challenges and the various medications have placed on their marriage and home life. The list of illnesses and medical conditions accumulated over his long life is a long one, and Will will elaborate on them during the course of the program. Welcome, Will, and thanks for taking the time to be with us, and even more so to share your life story, and especially the part that I think will really inspire anyone who may be struggling with the need to find their own yellow brick road and restore both physical and mental equilibrium to their life. Welcome, and thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So, I think it's interesting maybe to even start off with, you and I haven't known each other that long, but there's a little, Paula Harvey used to say, here's the rest of the story. Remember that? So please tell our listeners about the rest of the story and how you and I met and became friends.
There's a simple word I never thought about much until recently, and that's serendipity. I had a lot of physical issues and hadn't felt very good at all for several months, but have struggled with health issues for a long time. And my wife talked me into going to yoga one day at the gym, and we went. We got there 1 minute before the door closed and the class started, and it was July the 7th, 10:59 for an 11 o'clock class. We got there. I remember all this because I didn't want to go.
Yeah.
I looked in the class and saw all these healthy young people and healthy older people sitting in there, and I said, we're late. Let's come back later. And we started to turn and walk away, and you got up from the other side of the gym and walked across the floor, came out that door, and convinced us to come back in. And as you said earlier, my life has changed. It changed my life for me much for the better.
Well, I would say to our listeners, if you have ever had anyone tell you that something you did changed their life, it warms your spirit in a way that I can only describe after Will told me that a few weeks back. So I'm just so thrilled that I did happen to look up and see Will and Ashley at the door and walked over and was able to persuade them to come. And it's just been an incredible change in Will's life that he's going to tell us about. I referenced the tragedy that you experienced as a teenager, and I'd like for you to elaborate on that some. Traumas of various kinds get internalized and get stored in our physical organs, and science says they become toxins if we don't deal with them in some way, and they can affect us both mentally and physically. Now, you've talked already a little bit about the physical side of your health and some of the issues you had to deal with. Talk both about your mental side and the physical side and how that incident so many years ago did change your life.
Yeah, I think emotionally, the first thing I can think about is when I was 4 years old, my next door neighbor drowned in the lake in front of our house on a boat dock that we shared. It was a judge that lived next door to us, Judge Phelps, and his son was 12 years old. And he jumped from the dock to a boat and uh, landed on the edge of the boat, fell into the lake, and panicked. And my dad found him, and I was in the front yard watching as all this went down. And not only was it traumatizing for a 4 year old, but living next to the family, we saw the tragedy that caused with them and the grief. And so, that was permanently etched in my brain, and I had this built in anxiety or fear of what life had to offer. And then, of course, as you go down the road and other family members and stuff die, you experience that too. But it's not quite the same as when a child dies and you see the effect it has on the family. And so I had that with me, but it wasn't severe or debilitating, probably in any way. If anything, it maybe made me a little cautious. But then at 16, when I lost my leg, that would be the second incident, and that was a accident. Another friend accidentally shot me when he was taking a gun out of the car with a deer rifle. Shot me in the leg, and I lost my leg below my knee. And the first part of that was so bad is that if you go back to the to 1970 when it happened, technology was vastly different than it is today, and having a leg fit comfortably and not cause pain was almost impossible. And every step I took for the next 25 years was painful, and sometimes so painful that I could hardly walk. And that has an effect on you. It makes it hard for you to think and focus. But the upside to that is that you learn to deal with it. And the way I learned to deal with it was to surround myself with things. It could be work, it could be friends, it could be sports. For instance, a sport for a one legged man would be a bicycle. I also became involved in music and even art for a short period of time. I was involved in pottery and in school. And after it happened, I went from being a C student to an honor roll student. And I read a lot more. I read a book every week my senior year of high school. Another change that happened is I went off to boarding school, college prep school in the New Orleans area, and it offered a lot of opportunities for me. I was born in the Mississippi Delta, and if you've lived in the Mississippi Delta, there's basically two things you can do: sports, hunt, and fish. And
Yes.
that's what we did. We played baseball all summer, football in the lot next door. I'm talking from the age of 6 or 7 up. Football in the lot next door all winter, and in between those games, we hunted and fished. And when you have one leg, all of those things are a little harder to do.
Yeah.
So getting to New Orleans exposed me to a whole new world.
Yeah, I should have mentioned Will grew up in Greenville, Mississippi, right on the banks of the Mississippi River. So your reference to the Delta, it literally does mean right on the river, which is idyllic in many ways, I guess. As a young man, being able to hunt, fish, and play sports is kind of a dream that most young men have. I heard once in talking about the two traumatic events, the drowning of your friend and then your own accident. I read once that none of us ever get out of high school in our minds. That those are the most, particularly our teen years, are our most formative years, and the things that happen to us, good and bad, get internalized in a way that things that happen to us the remainder of our life never do. So you talked about the incident with the drowning and how that has left some fear maybe in your life that may persist to this day. And I can certainly think back on my own life about things that happened. And for example, the economic circumstances in my family were such that we were living hand to mouth most of the time. And I've still got a scarcity mentality, no matter how prosperous I may be at any given time in my life. I'm still always worried about the next meal. So Anyway, I just had that thought about how those traumatic events from your teen years may be still carrying over with you in your life and may have affected your physical life and how that's played out.
Yeah, first it made me very cautious. And that in some ways is a good thing when you think about raising a family. I was stricter on them than my parents were on me. And some things I pretty much took out of our life. I didn't teach my kids to hunt. Fear of people not knowing how to handle guns, not of them or myself, but of I was shot by someone that didn't know how. So you become more cautious. But on the other side of that, you can limit yourself in what you do. And I think that uh, emotionally, it made me stronger, but at the same time, it put a lot of stress in my life, and it made me focus too much on other things and not myself when I needed to focus on myself.
Yes, yes. Well, that's a good segue to the whole issue of your work, and although you've been and are very successful, you have said that you found a refuge in your work, and that you didn't realize until much later in life the toll that was taking on your physical health and the accumulation of some of the. And I want you to talk about. You've got a whole list of things that have accumulated over the years that the last 6 months and this miracle that you've experienced in your life has dealt with. But I would like you to elaborate a little bit on that. Um, and just before you answer, I saw a speaker addressing a group of high pressure type A business executives who were very busy with their careers, trying to succeed and accumulating the toys that all of us aspire to when we were younger. And he said, "You gentlemen need to think about something that's very fundamental. Will you live to enjoy all your success?" And that really cast a very quiet pall over the room when he asked that, when everybody started thinking about that. So, talk about your life, the stress, the work, some of the physical ills that you think may have accumulated due to all this.
Well, the first thing, which I've already mentioned, was the physical pain that I had to endure for a lot of years in my prosthesis and the leg that I lost. But the second thing that happened is in the early 90s, they discovered hepatitis C, and I found out that I had the HCV virus. I didn't feel bad. I had taken fairly good care of myself, so the hepatitis C had never really popped up, but just in a routine physical, they found it. And that was in the early 90s, I think around 1992. And we monitored it for about 6 or 7 years. And by the late 90s, they could see that it was doing a little damage to my liver, and a treatment had come into the marketplace. It was interferon and ribavirin. And so I opted to try one of the treatments, knowing that at best it was about 15% efficacy. And I thought it was worth the chance, though, because I didn't want to die. Uh, so I took the very first therapy in 1999, and it lasted for 50 weeks, almost an entire year. And if I said I was miserable, it's an understatement. I was really sick. Interferon's used in cancer therapy, and they give cancer patients interferon for 6 weeks, and you hear them talk about how bad they felt. 50 weeks was an enormous amount of time, and then, unfortunately, when they tested me 6 months later, the hepatitis C was back. It hadn't cleared it up, which we knew it probably wouldn't. So again, in the early 2000s to mid 2000s, I tried a second attempt at it. And in the second attempt, I felt so bad, I quit uh, a couple of months into it. And the lingering effects from the first one had lasted with me until the second one. So for several years, it had affected my brain and my physical health, making me my brain a little foggy and my memory depleted somewhat. and I never really got back to feeling like I had before I started the chemotherapy. So in the time period between the second one and my final one in around 2010, which did work and cured the hepatitis C, I gained a lot of weight. And I blame that on the fact that I felt so bad during the chemotherapy and immediately afterwards that I ate to feel better. It became a pleasure center for me. I didn't drink. Drinking alcohol with hepatitis C is a death sentence, and I saw enough people die from that that I wouldn't go down that road. So eating was my form of drug, and I would binge eat, and so I gained a lot of weight. Well, a guy with one leg gaining a lot of weight is not a good thing.
Right.
So
Right.
by the time I got to the late 2008, 2009, first part of this century, I had a herniated disc in my neck and another one in my lower back. And now technology had progressed enough that my left leg, which is where my prosthesis is, was no longer in pain, but my right leg was in constant pain for bearing all the weight for 25 plus years and then putting extra weight on it. And when I say extra weight, by the mid 2000s, I had gained probably 60 pounds since when I got married. And I had surgery on my neck, and following that surgery, like the hepatitis C treatment, it didn't stop the pain. And so I opted not to have another surgery on my lower back. Uh, in that same time frame, I slipped down one day. I stepped out of my car into a parking lot, and there was an area that was real mossy and wet, and I slipped down, and when I tried to catch myself, I used my hand, and it broke my wrist. The bone actually came through the skin, and I had two major surgeries on that wrist. I had another surgery on my elbow to try and relieve pressure on the nerve that was causing the pain in my neck. And I really had no success with any of the surgeries other than the left wrist. That was a success. I can use my left wrist now, but there is pain in the left wrist too. Then to complicate matters even more, I took a third treatment for the hepatitis C, this time with a new drug called telaprevir, which is in a new class of protease inhibitors, and it's no longer on the market because it was so toxic and it made me sicker than I'd ever been. But this time I was determined to beat it, so I stuck with it, and it was only 6 months, not 50 weeks. And it cured the hepatitis C. But coming out of that, I was overweight, I was depressed, I was in pain, and I continued to eat and gain more weight. And eventually, I had kidney stones and dealt with that. One of them was so large, the kidney stone wouldn't pass, and it lodged when it tried to pass, and I had to have a surgery to remove it. And not long after that, I discovered I had diabetes. And then in that same time frame, I learned that although the hepatitis C was cured, I had a new form of hepatitis that the medical community had begun to discover called NASH, non-alcohol steatohepatitis, which is basically fatty liver from being so overweight. So now I have another form of hepatitis, diabetes, kidney problems, and combine that with the pain, and I was miserable all the time. So my wife convinced me to visit a pain therapist, and I started to see her. And at the time I first went to see her, my bedside table was really an area cleared to hold all the medications I had to take. I also had high blood pressure, which kind of comes with the territory of overeating. I had high cholesterol, so I had medication for that. I couldn't sleep at night, so I had medication for that. Sometimes I had anxiety, so I had medication for that. And I probably can't list all the medications, but it was a lot. So I start to see this pain therapist, and it turns out that she suffered from chronic pain. And she told me the way that she dealt with it was through meditation and yoga. And she recommended me finding a yoga class, and she recommended me possibly joining the Transcendental Meditation Center and practicing meditation. You know, I'm a guy that grew up hunting and fishing.
That sounded really
Yeah.
weird to you, huh? Yeah.
You know, and then when I got into music, I liked rock guitar.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, so those things didn't sound like they
Right.
were in my world,
Right.
and I ignored her advice. But you know, my wife started to chime in with her, and when your wife starts to nag, I start to listen.
Right.
So about 2 years into my therapy sessions with Linda O'Toole, and she's a wonderful person, she convinced me to try yoga with Ashley. Oh, and another thing I want to mention, in all this time, I knew my health, that I needed to exercise, I needed to eat better. So I tried numerous diets. And I mean, if you walk around my office now, you'll find health equipment in here. But the problem is they never stuck. You know, there would be a fad. I would try them for a little while. I even lost a lot of weight on the Atkins diet one time, over 40 pounds. And I gained 50 pounds back, you know, the following year.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think part of it is that the stress that you deal with becomes overbearing to some degree, and I would give up and go back to my old habits because I never truly felt good. I never could get beyond it, and I think one of the missing ingredients was the meditation, which is part of yoga. So anyway, my wife convinced me to go with her down to LA Fitness to the yoga class, and that's where I met you. And the most amazing thing about it, when I met you and you convinced Ashley and I to come into the class, at the end of the class, you came over and you introduced me to Michael, and you told Ashley and I that you had a book about yoga. And we, in the car back to the house, I have a Kindle Unlimited, and I downloaded your book and was reading it on the way home.
Oh.
And, you know, it was like all things that I read, whether it's Huckleberry Finn or whether it's Kurt Vonnegut or your book, there's certain parts I can relate to, and I related to a lot in your book.
Yeah.
So I took it seriously, and you introduced me to Michael Vestaudu, who was our yoga instructor, and he's a wonderful person. And your two personalities combined, and I say this often, people have a lot to do with everything in our lives. When you meet people that inspire you. I had been to one or two other yoga classes, and you know, would leave and never go back. And I was a member of the YMCA that's just a few blocks from my house for several years, and only went one time. Scheduled a lot of yoga classes and never made them because I always felt like something important came up, and I took care of the business first. But meeting you and Michael convinced me to come back a second time, and which was the very next day, that Sunday. And so it was hard. I had one leg, and I was self-conscious about it. I would see people do some incredible things in that room, and I would think I could never do this. But the amazing thing is, at the end of that first class and the second class, I felt better than I did than when I came in. And in fact, I felt better than any medication made me feel. I mean, at this point in time, one thing I left out is I was taking shots for my diabetes, and they never made me feel better. They just maintained and kept me alive. Yeah. And I have to give the medical community credit for keeping me alive through all this. A lot of people that had as much as I had would either give up or would die for not taking care of themselves. So I felt better. The third class, Anne was the instructor, and I'll never forget, 10 minutes into it, I couldn't go anymore, and I was sitting on the mat, and she came by and suggested that I kind of keep the pose and just breathe, and I did. So in a 1 hour class, you know, I spent 10 minutes, but I remember telling you in one of those early classes, I think I can do this. Yeah. But then the most amazing thing happened. Within 2 weeks, I felt better than I'd felt in probably 30 years. So even though I hadn't really lost any weight and not a lot had changed, I felt better. And then the second amazing thing, within a month, all of my blood work started to improve. When you have as many ailments as I had, I have a urologist, an endocrinologist, a liver specialist, a therapist, a licensed therapist for pain, and a general physician. So I saw a doctor every month. I had blood work every month. And my blood work started to improve. Things like my um, blood pressure started coming down. And I got off the blood pressure meds first. Cholesterol came down. And another amazing thing, because of the yoga classes, after class, I didn't want to binge eat anymore.
Yeah.
I would come home and not be starved, and I could sleep. So another drug disappears, a sleep medication.
Was that Ambien? Was that the
That
one?
was Ambien.
Yeah.
And I'm cautious not to mention drugs that are on the market because they may be good for someone else. The
Right.
others, interferon, all that I mentioned,
Right,
are all
right.
off the market now. New, better cures for them, but that's absolutely what it was. And I mean, a generic form of Xanax too at times. Not often. It's a very addictive drug, but when I would be really stressed out,
Right.
I would take it sometimes. And I don't want to say that there's not a place in the world for them, but they really weren't doing anything for me. So, another drug goes off the shelf and I start to sleep better. And then another amazing thing happened. I started caring about what I ate. I found that I didn't have an appetite for fried chicken anymore.
Yeah.
And I didn't have an appetite for a chicken fried steak anymore with gravy on it and French fries. And not that I won't eat those things on rare occasions, but another big part of my life was sugar. I loved Cokes from Mexico with sugar in them. I loved cookies and ice cream, and a lot of my weight came from eating Ben and Jerry's.
Yeah. Well, there is science behind what you are saying, and I've been an emotional eater in my life as well. As I've told you, my nickname in college was Goat, because goats are famous for eating anything in sight. When you calm that monkey brain we're all born with, and can calm the anxiety and the stress, you are calming your emotional need to cope. If you are not willing to self-medicate with alcohol or pills, which a lot of people aren't, they think, well, because it's food, it's legal, it's fine. But obesity can kill you in time and give you life-altering illnesses, as you know yourself, just the same way alcohol can cause destruction in one's life. So the science behind all this, you talked about how good you felt after the first 2 or 3 sessions. We're all born with a Walgreens in the brain, as I like to call it. The day we're born, we've got 4 feel-good chemicals: oxytocin, serotonin, dopamine, and endorphins. And a practice of yoga and meditation stimulates the vagus nerve, which is the most important nerve in our entire body. It runs from our brain right to our toes. And so when you practice anything that stimulates that vagus nerve and activates those 4 feel-good chemicals, that's what causes the calm feeling that comes over your life, and also calms that emotional need to eat. So many, particularly men, have the same view that you said you had, which is, this is weird. I grew up hunting and fishing and playing sports. This is for girls. Here's a view some men have. It's not macho enough. You don't realize the change in your life this can bring. And to illustrate how the most macho professions of all are started doing this, LeBron James, Tom Brady, Russell Wilson, the whole Seattle Seahawks football team, the whole New England Patriots football team, the Golden State Warriors. In the military, the Green Berets, the Army, the Navy SEALs, the Green Berets are doing this to calm before battle. First responders, police and firemen are doing this. So it is a very macho thing to be able to calm your mind and deal with stress and anxiety in your life better than any of us have been able to before. So that's the science behind the effect in your life.
I read it in your book, and I agree with it 100%. And I've read it in other places too. I've read a lot of diet and exercise books trying to, cure my illnesses in the past. And I know that it's true. I even had a neighbor whose father was a Dr. Albert Goggins, and he wrote a book called The Man with a Clear Head, and he was one of the early doctors in the 60s that realized the relationship between type A personality and heart disease. And he got me involved in self-hypnosis class, which was really just a form of meditation, and explained all those things to me and taught me breathing techniques. And again, I didn't stick with them. I didn't think I needed them permanently. You start to feel better and lose a little weight, and then like I always do, I would kind of go back to my old habits, thinking I can always correct it again if I need to. But what I found with yoga is that the exercise and the meditation or the breathing techniques, and that's one of the things you told me outside of that class in that very first meeting, was that don't worry about trying to do everything that a lot of the young people in here do. It's about breathing. If you can breathe, you can do yoga.
Right.
And that's so true. And I attribute those two things, the exercise and the breathing, and the meditative state that we get in while we're doing the exercise, that make it so much more powerful than all the other trendy diets and exercise plans I've gotten behind.
Right. Well, it just goes to prove yet once again that the moral of the Wizard of Oz, that we have within us whatever we need. It was given to us on the day we were born. It's there. So, Will, the the physical transformation in your life is nothing short of miraculous. And I, in closing, want to thank you again for being willing to share this very inspiring story with you, or with our listeners. And to our listeners, as Will just said, if you can breathe, you can do this. And it can bring about incredible, miraculous things in your life. And I know that so many are dealing with, for example, America is now second only to Mexico in obesity on the entire planet. And obesity brings a number of issues that you elaborated in your own life. Diabetes, of course, being one, and a number of other things. So even though alcohol and pills may not be your way of coping, if food is your way of coping, this was a way to calm that need to eat emotionally, calm that monkey that we all have to deal with in our lives. So, Will, I want to thank you again. It's a very inspiring story. And I hope that all of our listeners have gained as much as I have from hearing Will's story. It's magic, but it is magic backed by science. And your road to a calm mind is your very own yellow brick road, and that's your breath. So thanks to everyone for listening. And Will, thanks again to you for sharing your story with us.
Thank you for having me on here, Alan, and it is a real honor to be with you. And, I owe you so much. I'll do anything I can to repay it.
Oh, thank you very much, Will. Thanks to everyone.